Welcome to Sinister States.
The first thing they tell you when you arrive is what the Lighthouse doesn't do. Not what it does, not how it works, or why it's still here, or who pays your wages. Just that simple clarification, delivered without ceremony by a man who won't give you his full name and never quite meets your eyes. This lighthouse does not warn ships. He says it like he's correcting a misunderstanding you haven't voiced yet, like you've asked a stupid question with your face. I remember nodding, because nodding felt safer than asking what that meant. I had taken the job because I needed the money, because the posting was vague in a way that suggested fewer background checks, and because the pay rate was high enough to feel like a mistake. Remote coastal position, overnight shifts, minimal supervision, experience preferred but not required. When I asked during the phone interview what, exactly, the work involved, the woman on the line paused for just long enough to make me feel like I'd said something impolite. You maintain the light, she said. You keep the logs. You stay inside after dark. She didn't explain that last part. I didn't press her. I told myself it was about weather, or wildlife, or liability. I told myself a lot of things during the drive up the coast, all of them comforting and all of them wrong. The lighthouse sits on a stretch of shoreline that looks unfinished, like the world stopped paying attention halfway through rendering it. The cliffs are jagged but not dramatic, the water restless but not beautiful. There's no town to speak of, just a scattering of buildings that look like they were put down temporarily and never picked back up. The road ends a quarter-mile from the tower, dissolving into gravel and then into nothing at all. From there, you walk. I carried my duffel, my groceries, and a box of notebooks I'd bought on impulse, because something about the job description made me think I'd need to write things down. The wind was constant, not strong enough to knock you over, just persistent enough to wear you down. The tower rose out of the fog like a suggestion rather than a structure, its white paint stained with rust and salt, its base wrapped in scaffolding that hadn't been touched in years. The light at the top was on, even though it was barely afternoon. It wasn't bright. It didn't cast a beam. It just glowed, steady and contained, like it was for itself alone. Inside, the air smelled old and damp and faintly metallic. The walls were lined with plaques I didn't read and equipment I didn't recognize. The man who met me at the door showed me the essentials without commentary. Generator room, supply closet, living quarters, the stairs that led up to the light, the stairs that led down to the lower levels. You won't need those, he said, gesturing to the door that disappeared underground. They're sealed anyway. When I asked what was down there, he smiled, thin and humorless. Records, he said. Things that don't matter anymore. He handed me a ring of keys, heavier than it needed to be, and a ledger bound in cracked leather. Log everything, he said. Weather, visibility, sounds, anything unusual. I asked him what qualified as unusual. He paused again, longer this time, then said, "You'll know." Before I could ask anything else, he was gone, walking back toward the road without looking back. I watched until the fog swallowed him, then closed the door and locked it, even though no one had told me to. The first night passed quietly enough to lull me into thinking I'd misread the tone of the whole thing. The light hummed. The wind rattled the windows. The sea did what seas do, crashing and retreating in an endless, indifferent rhythm. I wrote in the ledger because it felt expected, not because I had anything to say. Clear skies. Moderate wind. No vessels observed. When midnight came and went without incident, I laughed at myself for feeling tense. I made coffee. I unpacked. I climbed the stairs to the light and stood beside it, watching the fog swirl uselessly around the glass. The mechanism was old but well maintained, its rotation smooth, its glow unwavering. Still, something about it bothered me. Lighthouses are supposed to project, to reach out, to cut through darkness and uncertainty. This one didn't. The light stayed close, contained within the lantern room, illuminating dust and condensation in the inside of the glass, but nothing beyond it. I told myself it was broken. I told myself I'd report it in the morning. The second night, I saw the first ship. It was just a silhouette at first, a darker shape moving against the already dark water. No running lights. No sound. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going. I watched it through binoculars, waiting for it to turn away once it registered the lighthouse, waiting for some sign that it saw what I was seeing. It didn't change course. It didn't hesitate. It headed straight for the rocks. My first instinct was to reach for the radio, to broadcast a warning, to do the thing lighthouses have trained us all to expect. Then I remembered the man's voice. This lighthouse does not warn ships. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the controls. The ship drew closer, close enough that I could make out its shape more clearly, wrong in subtle ways that made my stomach tighten. The hull seemed too tall, the angles off, like a child's drawing of a boat rendered in metal. When it hit the rocks, there was no crash, no splintering. It slid forward, metal folding in on itself like wet paper, and then it was gone, swallowed by the surf. The water closed over it, smooth and unremarkable, as if nothing had happened at all. That I stood there for a long time after that, listening to my own breathing, waiting for the delayed sound of impact that never came. Eventually, I wrote it down. Vessel observed. No lights. No response. Loss of contact at 1:47.
My hand shook as I wrote, the ink blurring slightly where the pen pressed too hard into the page. I slept poorly after that, dreams filled with grinding metal and silent screams. In the morning, there was no debris on the shore, no oil slick, no sign that anything had ever been there. I told myself it was a trick of the fog, of exhaustion, of isolation. I told myself a lot of things, and none of them held up for very long. By the end of the first week, I'd seen 3 more ships. All of them approached the same way. All of them ignored the lighthouse entirely. All of them vanished without sound or trace. I tried the radio once, just to see if it worked, just to reassure myself that I had options. It crackled to life immediately, filled with static and a low, rhythmic pulse that made my teeth ache. I released the button and the sound stopped. When I checked the equipment later, it was in perfect working order. No faults, no anomalies. I logged everything, because that was the rule, and because writing it down felt like proof that I wasn't imagining it. The ledger grew heavier with each entry, the pages filling with careful observations and questions I didn't write out loud. I stopped going outside after dark. I stopped standing near the windows. I started locking doors that had never been unlocked. The first time I heard the bell, I thought it was part of the lighthouse. A low, distant toll, muffled by fog and wind, regular enough to suggest intention. I checked the tower for alarms, for old equipment that might still be active. I found nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, resonating through the stone and into my bones. It wasn't a buoy. It wasn't a foghorn. It was too deliberate for that, too measured. I wrote it down. Unknown auditory phenomenon. Possible maritime origin. Occurred at 3:12. When it came a third time, directly below the tower, I didn't write anything.
I sat on my cot and waited for it to stop, counting my breaths and reminding myself that nothing had tried to get in. Not yet. It was the logs from previous keepers that finally broke me. I hadn't gone looking for them at first. The ledger I'd been given only went back a few months, the handwriting consistent and restrained, the entries terse. But there was a locked cabinet in the lower living quarters, its key heavy and unfamiliar on the ring. Inside were notebooks stacked neatly, their covers faded, their spines cracked from use. I took one at random and flipped it open. The first entries were mundane. Weather, maintenance, supply inventories. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Mentions of vessels without names, of lights that moved beneath the water, of dreams shared by people who had never met. One keeper wrote about standing on the rocks at night, feeling the pull of the sea like a hand at his back. Another mentioned voices carried on the wind, speaking in languages he didn't know but somehow understood. The last entries in each notebook were always the same. A date, a time, a single sentence, written larger than the rest, pressed deep into the page. The light is not for them. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of other people's slow unraveling. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, like I'd been at sea myself. I understood then, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before, that the lighthouse wasn't broken. It was precise. The light wasn't meant to guide ships away from danger. It was meant to mark something else entirely, to signal a boundary, to say here and no further. I thought about the way the ships moved, unlit and silent, like they were being drawn in rather than passing through. I thought about the bell, tolling not as a warning but as an announcement. And I thought about the phrase that kept appearing in the logs, in different hands and different years, always the same words. The light is not for them.
That night, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The bell rang just after midnight, closer than ever, and I felt a pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. I climbed the stairs to the lantern room because something in me needed to see, needed to understand, even though every instinct I had told me to stay away from the windows. The light hummed, unchanged, its glow steady and inward. Outside, shapes moved in the fog, tall and indistinct, gathering where the water met the rocks. I couldn't see ships anymore. I could only see them, waiting. I told myself I wouldn't look for patterns anymore. That was the rule I made after the third ship, after the bell, after the logs. Patterns are how you give chaos a face, and once it has a face, it can start looking back at you. But isolation does things to your mind, especially when the sea is all you can hear and the fog presses in so tightly it feels like the world has shrunk to the size of the tower. You start cataloging details whether you want to or not. You notice the timing of the bell, always a few minutes past the hour, never exactly on it. You notice that the ships only appear on nights when the light feels warmer, less mechanical, like it's breathing. You notice that the dreams you try to forget in the morning match the entries in the old logs with unsettling precision. The dreams always start the same way. I'm standing at the base of the lighthouse, barefoot on wet stone, the sea pulled back farther than it should be, exposing slick rock and things embedded in it that look too symmetrical to be natural. The light above me is off in the dream, truly off, not glowing inward like it does when I'm awake. The darkness feels intentional, like something has chosen it. Then the bell rings, close enough that I can feel it vibrate in my teeth, and I know I'm supposed to go down. Not up to the light, but down, into the levels I was told were sealed.
In the dream, the door is always open, the stairs yawning wide and inviting, carved deeper than the tower should allow. I never make it all the way. I always wake up just as I'm about to take the first step, heart racing, the echo of the bell still hanging in the air. I started sleeping in short shifts after that, afraid of what I might do if the dream ever changed. Afraid that one night I wouldn't wake up in time. The ledger entries grew more fragmented, less clinical. Weather reports gave way to observations I didn't know how to categorize. Light temperatures subjectively increased. Bell audible at closer proximity. Visual disturbances in fog. I reread them in the mornings, embarrassed by my own language, but unable to deny what I'd experienced. The job had stopped feeling like something external, something I could clock in and out of. It felt like a role I was slipping into, one that had existed long before I arrived, and would continue after I was gone. On the 10th night, the radio turned itself on. I was in the kitchen area, making a cup of instant soup I didn't really want, when the static cut through the hum of the generator. It wasn't loud, just sudden, like a breath taken too sharply. Then came the pulse, that same low rhythm I'd heard when I tested it before, steady and deliberate. I stood there for a long moment, spoon frozen halfway to the cup, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. Over the static, something else began to emerge. At first it sounded like interference, random spikes and dips that my brain tried to shape into meaning. Then a voice pushed through, distorted but unmistakably human. Not a warning, it said. I crossed the room without thinking, hands shaking as I reached for the controls. Hello. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the noise. The static surged in response, the pulse quickening. For a moment, I thought I heard multiple voices layered together, overlapping and out of sync, like a crowd trying to speak through a single mouth.
Then one voice asserted itself again, clearer this time. Not for them. I released the button, heart hammering. The radio went silent instantly, as if it had never been on at all. I stood there long after, staring at my reflection in the darkened display, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That stress and lack of sleep can do remarkable things. That loneliness can manufacture company out of nothing. I wrote the incident down anyway, because that's what I did now. Radio activation without input. Vocal transmission received. Content unclear. When I closed the ledger, I noticed my handprint faintly impressed on the leather cover, the skin of my palm tingling as if I'd touched something charged. The next morning, the fog didn't lift. It's hard to explain how wrong that felt unless you've lived by the sea. Fog comes and goes. It rolls in thick and then thins out, pulled apart by wind and sun. This fog didn't behave like that. It clung to the ground and the water with equal stubbornness, a uniform gray that swallowed distance and depth. I couldn't see the rocks below the tower. I couldn't see the horizon. When I stepped outside briefly to check the generator exhaust, the world seemed to end a few feet away in every direction. Sound was muted, flattened, like I was underwater. I retreated back inside with a sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. That afternoon, I found the door to the lower levels unlocked. I noticed it because the air around it felt different, cooler and faintly damp, carrying a smell I hadn't encountered in the tower before. Not mold, not rust, but something organic and old, like seaweed left too long in the sun. The heavy metal door stood ajar by a few inches, the darkness beyond it deeper than the shadows elsewhere. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, listening. There was no sound from below. No bell, no water, just a pressure, subtle but insistent, like gravity was stronger in that direction.
I told myself it was a mistake, that I must have unlocked it without remembering. That curiosity was a liability I couldn't afford. I closed the door and locked it, testing the handle twice to make sure it held. All the while, I was aware of the way my body leaned toward it, like a compass needle straining toward north. That night, the ships came closer than ever before. There were 3 of them, spaced evenly across the water, their silhouettes emerging from the fog like thoughts surfacing from a dream. Still no lights, still no sound. They moved in perfect synchrony, maintaining their formation as they advanced. I watched from the lantern room, my breath fogging the glass, a sick fascination rooting me in place. The bell began to ring as they reached the shallows, its tone deeper now, resonating through the tower in a way that made my vision blur at the edges. I wanted to look away. I couldn't. As the ships reached the rocks, something rose to meet them. At first, I thought it was a wave, a swell pulled up unnaturally high by the tide. Then I saw the shapes within it, darker than the surrounding water, elongated and jointed, moving with purpose. The ships didn't crash. They didn't break apart. They were taken, lifted and folded into the water by those shapes, disappearing beneath the surface with a smooth inevitability that made my stomach churn. The bell rang once more, a single, satisfied toll, and then fell silent. I don't know how long I stayed there after that. When I finally tore myself away, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I stumbled down the stairs and into the living quarters, hands shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor to keep from falling. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly trapped. Not just by the isolation, but by the understanding that the lighthouse wasn't passive in any of this. It was participating.
I slept despite myself, exhaustion pulling me under like an undertow. The dream was different this time. I was on the stairs, descending, the sound of water echoing below me. The walls were carved with marks that looked like writing until I got closer and realized they were impressions, as if something had pressed itself repeatedly into the stone. The bell rang overhead, distorted by distance. When I reached the bottom, there was no floor, just an opening that led directly out into the sea. Shapes moved beyond it, vast and patient. One of them turned toward me, and I understood without words that the light was never meant to guide ships. It was meant to guide them. I woke up on the floor by the locked door, my hand wrapped around the unfamiliar key, the sound of the bell still reverberating in my skull. By the time morning came, the fog still hadn't moved. It pressed against the lighthouse like a held breath, dense and unmoving, as if the world beyond the walls had been deliberately erased. I checked the time 3 separate times because it felt wrong, like night had overstayed its welcome. The light continued its steady inward glow, unchanged by what it had witnessed. That bothered me more than anything else. Machines should show strain. Systems should react to abnormal conditions. The lighthouse didn't. It simply existed, perfectly content with its role. I tried to leave. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no sudden burst of courage or panic. Just a quiet, rational conclusion that staying was no longer survivable. I packed my duffel with shaking hands, moving too quickly and then too slowly, my sense of time slipping. I left the ledger on the table, deliberately. It felt like a tether, like taking it with me would mean I was still agreeing to participate. When I opened the door, the fog rolled inward immediately, cool and damp against my face. I stepped out anyway, following the path toward where the road should have been.
After 10 minutes of walking, I realized something was wrong. The ground beneath my feet hadn't changed. The gravel hadn't turned to dirt, then to asphalt like it should have. The wind hadn't shifted. When I stopped and turned around, the lighthouse was still there, the same distance behind me as it had been when I started. I walked faster, then jogged, my breath coming sharp and loud in the quiet. The fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet, but the tower remained, fixed in my peripheral vision no matter which way I turned. I felt a flicker of something close to hysteria rise in my chest, but I forced it down. Panic would only make me sloppy. I walked for another half hour, marking my steps, counting them. Nothing changed. Eventually, I stopped, heart pounding, and laughed weakly at the absurdity of it. The lighthouse does not warn ships. The thought came unbidden, heavy with implication. It doesn't warn them because they're not the ones in danger. I turned back and walked toward the tower, because pretending I had a choice felt worse than admitting I didn't. The door opened easily when I reached it, the interior warm and dim and horribly familiar. I locked it behind me out of habit, then rested my forehead against the cool metal and tried not to cry. That afternoon, I finally opened the ledger again. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe new entries, written while I'd been outside. Maybe instructions that hadn't been there before. Instead, the last page was blank, waiting. I stared at it for a long time before picking up the pen. When I touched it, the pressure in my head eased slightly, like something approving my compliance. I wrote everything. The fog, the failed escape, the certainty growing in my gut that the lighthouse wasn't a place so much as a function. When I finished, my hand cramped and my wrist ached, but the feeling of being watched receded just enough for me to breathe. That night, there were no ships.
The sea was quiet, unnaturally so, its surface smooth beneath the fog. The bell didn't ring. The radio stayed silent. I should have been relieved. Instead, the stillness felt anticipatory, like the pause before something immense shifts its weight. I found myself standing by the sealed door again, staring at the keyhole. The unfamiliar key was back on the ring, heavier than before. I hadn't put it there. I knew, with a clarity that frightened me, that this was the night the dreams had been preparing me for. I unlocked the door. The stairs spiraled downward farther than they should have been able to, carved from stone older than the tower above them. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of salt and decay. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate either. The bell rang once as I descended, not above me, but all around, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. The sound wasn't hostile. It was welcoming. At the bottom, the passage opened into a vast chamber that defied the geometry of the lighthouse entirely. Water lapped at the edges of the floor, black and glassy, reflecting the faint glow that seeped from veins in the stone. Shapes moved beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. I understood then that the ships were offerings, not victims. They were never meant to pass safely. They were meant to arrive. Something rose from the water. It wasn't one thing. It was many, connected, layered, unfolding upward in a way my mind struggled to track. There were suggestions of limbs, of eyes, of structures that echoed the angles of the ships I'd seen consumed. When it focused on me, the pressure in my chest returned, stronger now, but not painful. Curious, expectant. I knew, without being told, that I was being measured. I dropped the key into the water. The response was immediate. The shapes shifted, ripples spreading outward in complex patterns. Images pressed into my mind, not memories but instructions. The lighthouse wasn't a trap. It was a filter.
A signal visible only to those who didn't belong in the water above. The light drew them in, not to be destroyed, but to be redirected. Claimed. The bell marked the moment of transfer, and the keeper was there to make sure nothing interfered, including themselves. I understood the logs then. The missing endings. No one quit this job. They either failed or they finished. The thing in the water didn't need me forever. It needed continuity, a human presence to maintain the mechanism, to log the events, to keep the boundary intact. In return, it offered something that felt like mercy, an end that wasn't sudden, a choice that felt like one. When I backed away, the shapes receded, sinking back into the water with patient grace. The chamber dimmed. The bell fell silent. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, carrying the weight of what I'd agreed to without ever speaking the words. When I locked the door behind me, the fog outside began to thin, just slightly, that I returned to the lantern room before dawn. The light felt warmer now, almost gentle. For the first time since I'd arrived, I stood beside it without fear. Far out at sea, beyond where any normal vessel would be, something vast shifted beneath the surface. It didn't approach. It didn't need to. I opened the ledger and wrote one final entry for the night, my handwriting steady. I stopped marking days after that. Time flattened into maintenance cycles, into the rhythm of checks and recordings and quiet acknowledgments of movement beneath the water. The fog came and went again, behaving like fog should, and the road returned, visible but irrelevant. Supply boats arrived once a month, crewed by people who never looked directly at the tower and never asked about the bell. They left crates at the edge of the path and departed quickly, as if lingering might invite questions they didn't want answered.
The ships still came. Not every night, not even every week. But when they did, I felt it hours beforehand, a subtle tension in the light, a warmth in the air that settled into my bones. I logged everything. I always would. The bell rang. The water opened. The boundary held. Nothing came ashore. Sometimes I think about leaving again. The thought surfaces the way an old habit does, familiar and weak. I know what would happen if I tried. The lighthouse would still be behind me. The job would still be mine. Choice is a generous word for a narrow path. I've learned what the light feels like when it's hungry. I've learned the difference between ships that struggle and ships that surrender. I've learned that some things in the fog look almost human until you see how they move. None of that goes in the official ledger. Some records are not meant to travel. On clear nights, when the sea is calm and empty, I climb to the lantern room and rest my hand against the glass. The glow reflects back at me, turning my face pale and indistinct, like I'm already becoming part of the structure. I wonder if that's what happened to the others. Not death. Not exactly. Just gradual integration. A person worn down into a purpose. If you ever see this lighthouse from the water, you won't notice anything unusual. The light won't reach for you. The bell won't sound. You'll pass by without incident, convinced you were never in danger at all. And you'll be right, because the lighthouse does not warn ships. It warns what waits beneath them. I will stay until the light no longer needs hands, until the logs end on their own. If someone replaces me, I will not stop them. I will simply step aside and let the mechanism accept a new shape. That is how this place survives. That is how it has always survived. The sea takes what is offered. The light keeps what remains. And I keep watch. For now, the boundary holds. The bell sleeps. And the darkness below is patient, knowing it will be seen when it is time.
Nothing here rushes. Nothing here will.